Put on your togas, because we're about to perform a postmortem on one of the most infamous cinematic disasters ever made. So grab your scalpels, because we're cutting into Tinto Brass's big-budget historical epic / adult film, Caligula, on today's episode of Deep Cuts. I wasn't quite 8 years old when Caligula made its US debut in February of 1980, so there was no way I was able to see it back then. But I was sort of tangentially aware of the film because it was very controversial and people were talking about it a lot. 7-year-old me wasn't really sure why it was controversial at the time, beyond it having a lot of sex in it, but needless to say, this film title immediately got filed away in my brain for a time when I was older. When I did finally see it, back in the early 90s, it definitely lived up to my expectations. Caligula is Exhibit A in my argument that nothing succeeds like excess. It's a brash, vulgar, over-the-top piece of cinema that's so captivating in some unintentional ways that you simply can't stop watching it. I mean, it's over 2.5 hours long, clearly made by people who were not on the same page, and features genuine talents like Peter O'Toole and Helen Mirren in scenes with penthouse pets. If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know how else to sell you on this movie. Like so many of the films I cover on this channel, Caligula's behind-the-scenes stories are every bit as interesting as the actual film. Caligula was basically the idea of Penthouse magazine publisher Bob Guccione. The magazine had been funding films for years, but Guccione had this idea that he wanted to produce a big-budget historical epic adult film. And he thought, rightfully so apparently, that Caligula was the perfect subject. I mean, it's hard to fault him for this conclusion. The only historical figure who might have been more perfect for Penthouse's first foray into artsy crossover adult cinema was probably the Marquis de Sade. And interestingly enough, Joe D'Amato actually made an adult film about the Marquis de Sade in 1994 with adult film legend Rocco Siffredi in the lead role. Anyway, Guccione teamed up with producer Franco Rossellini, who was the nephew of Roberto Rossellini, and commissioned a script for his historical epic from Lina Wertmuller. Guccione was displeased by that script, so he scrapped it and hired Gore Vidal. Vidal was reportedly paid $200,000 for his script for Gore Vidal's Caligula, and Guccione eventually hired Salon Kitty director Tinto Brass to shepherd the project from page to screen. Vidal and Brass would both eventually distance themselves from the finished version of Caligula. Guccione was unhappy with Vidal's script because it focused too heavily on homosexual sex scenes. Guccione wanted a more heterosexual adult film, it seems, and he demanded extensive rewrites. Brass, who was by most accounts a difficult director, landed the gig after meeting with Guccione, who thought he was the right fit after seeing Brass's film Salon Kitty. Although, to be fair, he was not the Penthouse publisher's first choice. According to historical record, both Lina Wertmuller and John Huston declined to direct Caligula before Brass was offered the job. Brass, for his part, pretty much immediately clashed with Vidal. The director wanted to rewrite the script as part of his package for directing, and Guccione agreed. Brass's script contributions seem to have mostly been adding more group sex scenes and adding a lot of adult cinema decorations to the set. Like most writers, Gore Vidal did not care for being rewritten, particularly by Tinto Brass. Things between the writer and director got progressively worse from there. Vidal insisted directors were parasites and that the screenwriter was the real author of the film, which absolutely flies in the face of auteur theory. For his part, Brass didn't take that well and insisted Vidal be barred from the set, something Guccione went along with. Ultimately, they removed Vidal's name from the film. The title was no longer Gore Vidal's Caligula, but instead just Caligula. And he didn't even get a screenwriter's credit on the finished film. Instead, it just says, adapted from a screenplay by Gore Vidal. But hey, don't feel too bad for Gore. He did okay. I mean, he got that $200,000 check to dry his tears with. With Vidal now out of the way, you'd assume this meant smooth sailing for Brass. But such was not the case. Brass and Guccione were a volatile mix, each with different opinions on what they wanted the film to be. Guccione was trying to create some sort of big-budget adult art film that he hoped would have an impact like Citizen Kane. Yeah, right. While Brass seemed mostly interested in making a more blackly comedic historical epic with some softcore sleaze, which really aligns with what you'd expect from a guy like Tinto Brass. Guccione wanted penthouse pets in every shot with the A-list cast and plenty of real intercourse. Brass wasn't really down with that idea, it seems, and often would annoy his producer by not shooting the pets at all. Speaking of that A-list cast, perhaps the most amazing thing about Caligula is that they got real Hollywood talent to headline it. Malcolm McDowell is the title character. Helen Mirren turns up as his wife. Peter O'Toole takes the part of Tiberius, and Sir John Gielgud is here too. Reportedly, they even offered Orson Welles $1 million to be Tiberius, but he turned down the part because he found the script troubling. Welles was hardly the only guy to turn down appearing in the film. It's been reported that Jack Nicholson was considered for the lead role before they finally settled on McDowell. Charlotte Rampling says she was offered a part, as does Sylvia Christel. And even when the film did cast actors, they couldn't always keep them. Last Tango in Paris actress Maria Schneider was cast as Caligula's sister Drusilla, but dropped out because the film's nudity and sex scenes made her uncomfortable. She was eventually replaced by actress Teresa Ann Savoy. With an A-list cast, a director, and a script, they could finally start making Guccione's sure-to-be epic adult film. And they did. Caligula was filmed in 1976, wrapping up principal production on Christmas Eve that year. Guccione complained about the sheer amount of footage Brass had shot, saying they had enough to make, quote, the original version of Ben-Hur about 50 times over. For his part, Brass went to work editing the film, but like Vidal and Wertmuller before him, he was about to discover that working for Guccione was not without its challenges. Brass reportedly edited about an hour of Caligula before being relieved of his duties. Guccione brought in other uncredited editors who disassembled Brass's early partial cut and rebuilt it from scratch. The problem was that this was at odds with what Brass's vision of the film was. The new cut had a different rhythm, the scene order was swapped, there was different music, and it was really no longer a Tinto Brass film beyond him having been the guy who shot the scenes. Things would only get worse for the director, though. Remember earlier when I said that Brass and Guccione had a sort of artistic philosophical difference about the tone of the film, and that Guccione wanted to make an artsy adult movie while Brass seemingly wanted to make a historically epic black comedy? Well, that issue was now about to be resolved once and for all. After production wrapped, Guccione and Giancarlo Louis gathered up a few penthouse pets and went back to Italy. Here in Rome, they hired a small crew and snuck into the studio at night to film more hardcore scenes. These new explicit scenes were then edited into the film, at which point Brass disowned the project. You'll notice in the credits he's not listed as a director, but like Gore Vidal, he basically gets a lesser acknowledgement. In this case, it's principal photography by Tinto Brass. So, if you're keeping score at home, Vidal and Brass are basically gone, making Caligula essentially a Bob Guccione joint. Amazingly, none of the actors really disowned it. Helen Mirren actually defends it, calling it an irresistible mix of art and genitals. And really, she's not wrong. If you've been paying attention, you may have noticed that I said Caligula wrapped production in December of 1976, but earlier in this episode I said the film had its US release in early 1980. So what happened during those 3+ years? Between shooting the new hardcore sequences, letting Brass edit almost half a film, then scrapping it and starting over, and tracking down actors to re-record dialogue, Caligula felt like a film that might never see the light of a theater projector's bulb. Eventually, Caligula did wrap up post-production and was ready for the world. The only problem? The world was not ready for Caligula. With their film now completed, Guccione was about to face down a new set of challenges: censors and obscenity laws. Caligula had a small opening in Rome on November 11, 1979. By the 15th, Italian authorities had confiscated the film, calling it, quote, flagrantly obscene, which was really just a portent of things to come. Back here in the States, Guccione tried to circumnavigate the MPAA ratings board and the X rating they'd have surely given Caligula by refusing to submit it for a rating at all and slapping a mature audiences tag on it and insisting it not be shown to anyone under 18. Guccione still had delusions of grandeur for Caligula, hoping it was a film that would bridge a gap between adult cinema and art house fare, apparently. The idea of the film earning an X rating back in the days before the NC-17 existed felt demeaning to Guccione and really would have convinced most audiences it was an adult film like you'd find in a 42nd Street grindhouse. This was definitely not Guccione's target audience. In fact, Guccione was so concerned about the perception of the film that he kept tight control on the prints. For Caligula, Guccione handled the prints directly, not leasing them to locations, but instead renting out art house theaters solely for the purpose of screening the film. This way, Guccione could put the film in theaters where it would have an air of artistic legitimacy while also keeping it out of adult theaters who would have assuredly leased prints and convinced people this was not a, quote, mainstream film. And yet, even this ploy did not really work. Caligula was seized by US customs agents when Guccione brought the print here from Italy. It was not found to be obscene, but that wouldn't stop other cities from trying to seize or ban the film. Boston authorities were the next to claim it violated obscenity laws in the city. That case got to a judge who ruled that it wasn't obscene. While the sex scenes were designed to appeal to, quote, prurient interests, the depictions of ancient Rome allowed it to pass the Miller test, which is a test courts use to determine if something is obscene. It's too complicated to get into here, but you can look it up if you're curious. A Madison, Wisconsin DA refused to bring a motion to bar the film from screening there because he felt the film was more objectionably violent than sexual, and violent content wasn't prohibited by law. Atlanta then threatened to ban the film, but the courts there again ruled it wasn't obscene. The film did not escape unscathed everywhere, though. Caligula was banned in Australia until 1981. It was banned in Russia until 1993. It was banned in parts of Canada for a time. The UK appears to have finally passed the 156-minute version in 2008. It remains banned in Belarus still. And speaking of that 156-minute cut of the film, for years there have been whispers of a 3-hour and 30-minute version of Caligula. Naturally, this has inspired a lot of curiosity amongst cult film fans who want to know what got cut from that version. However, it's apparently just an urban legend created thanks to some unclear writing. Contrary to widespread belief, there seems to be no evidence supporting the existence of the infamous 3-hour and 30-minute pre-release version of the movie. As I understand it, the confusion stems from an error in a movie program distributed for the initial public screening at the Cannes Trade Festival, which is different from the Cannes Film Festival. This program erroneously indicated that the Caligula screening had a total duration of 3 hours and 30 minutes. However, what the program failed to clarify was that the 2-hour and 36-minute movie, along with a 1-hour making-of featurette, were consecutively presented that night, resulting in a perceived 3.5-hour runtime. For his part, Guccione didn't really mind the legal challenges because there's no such thing as bad publicity. He felt that the coverage was better marketing than money could buy, so every time some group of moral watchdogs tried to ban or block the film, it was more free press for Caligula. To be fair, Caligula is not a good film. It has a good cast, it had a decent budget, and the character of Caligula is one ripe with potential for exploration in a historical biopic. But Bob Guccione and Tinto Brass were never really interested in making that kind of film. Caligula fails as Guccione's Citizen Kane of adult cinema, but as a movie where you can watch Malcolm McDowell and Peter O'Toole act while a bunch of penthouse pets get busy in the background, well, you'd be hard-pressed to find that anywhere else, and that has to count for something. Caligula is a monument to bad taste and excess, and I love it for that. Plus, as the years have passed, the film has found its champions, which always makes me smile. As for the original Caligula, well, the road in the decades since its initial release have been no less rocky. The film seemingly goes in and out of print for stretches of time. There was an Imperial Edition set back in 2007. In 2020, Thomas Nagovin announced he was working on a different restoration of the film, this one focusing on Vidal's original script. This ultimate cut had a 2023 Cannes premiere, but immediately sparked controversy when Tinto Brass started legal proceedings over the project. The director made this statement. After numerous and fruitless negotiations that have followed over the years, first with Penthouse and then with other unclear individuals, to edit the material that I shot and which had been found in the Penthouse archives, a version has been created on which I did not take part and which I am not convinced will reflect my artistic vision. The Cannes audience will therefore be misled by the arbitrary use of my name. And as the Talking Heads once sang, same as it ever was. I mean, it's wild that over 4 decades later, they're still fighting over this film. But Nagovin's version is available on Blu-ray, so you can definitely pick it up. Even by today's standards, Caligula is a strong film guaranteed to offend the prudish and the squeamish. The Guccione sex scenes are as graphic as traditional adult cinema, and the film also boasts some fine grue. Although to be fair, the gore effects aren't as convincing as they should be. Exploitation fans should be more than satisfied with this film. While there can be no real doubt that Caligula is a bad film, although not as bad as stuff like Showgirls, it's also a movie that's become one of my guilty pleasures. It's hard not to like McDowell's gratuitous performance as he capers around the film's elaborate sets carrying on like a madman. Not to mention any film that features such copious amounts of both nudity and bloodletting is bound to make my cult favorites list. Caligula succeeds in a way. Sure, it's not the powerful artistic film the creator set out to make, but it is exactly what it wants to portray. A full-blown exercise in excess that demonstrates overindulgence often leads to failure and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you're a fan of schlock cinema, Caligula should definitely be near the top of your must-rent list. It's so bad, it's almost amazing. Have you seen Caligula, or is this your first experience with it? Leave me a comment and let me know what you think of it. And if you're looking for another deep cut into a cult classic, be sure to check out my video on what happened to the lost footage of Event Horizon. You'll find a link here on the screen. I'll see you over there.